The underground palace stretched for miles beneath the surface of Velara Prime, its walls made of crystal that glowed with soft blue light. Jake Morrison stood at his post outside the Queen's private chambers, his rifle held across his chest in the standard guard position. He had been standing there for 3 hours, and he would stand for 3 more before his shift ended. That was the job 5 years ago. Jake would have laughed if someone told him he would end up as a royal guard on an alien planet. Back then, he was just a security officer in Las Vegas, working casino floors and breaking up fights between drunk tourists. Then humanity made first contact and everything changed. The galaxy opened up and suddenly there were job postings for humans willing to leave Earth and work in places with names he couldn't pronounce. The pay was incredible. The Valoran Empire needed guards from different species, something about showing unity across their territories. Jake applied on a whim, passed the tests, and 6 months later found himself on a transport ship heading into deep space. His mom cried when he left. His sister Kate punched him in the arm and made him promise to send messages every week. He kept that promise, mostly. The palace was unlike anything on Earth. Everything was huge, built for beings much larger than humans. The Valerans were insectoid, with hard shells that shimmered in colors Jake didn't have names for. They moved on 6 legs and had 4 arms, and their faces were all compound eyes and clicking mandibles. It took Jake months to read their expressions, to understand when Queen Sivara was pleased or concerned or tired. Queen Sivara was old, even by Valoran standards. She had ruled for over 200 years, which seemed impossible to Jake until he learned that Valerans could live for 3 centuries if they were lucky. She moved slower than the younger Valerons, and her shell had faded to a pale green that the other guards said meant great age and wisdom. Jake just thought she seemed lonely. The other guards were from different species, each one stranger than the last. There was Kresh, a reptilian warrior from the Kreth homeworld, covered in red scales and standing 8 feet tall. He rarely spoke to Jake, considering humans to be weak and temporary. Then there was Lyra, one of the Shardborn, a being made of living crystal that could break apart and reform at will. She spoke in musical tones that Jake's translator struggled to interpret. The Nethville guard, whose name Jake never learned to pronounce, was a gaseous being that floated in a containment suit and smelled like ozone. Jake was the only human in the Royal Guard. There were other humans on Velara Prime, mostly diplomats and traders, but Jake was the only one who had been hired to protect the Queen herself. The other guards found this amusing. They made jokes he pretended not to understand. Comments about how humans were soft and breakable, how they lived such short lives that they barely had time to learn anything useful, but Queen Sivara never treated him that way. She would sometimes pause when passing his post and ask him questions about Earth. She wanted to know about oceans, something Velara Prime didn't have. She asked about forests and rain and seasons. She seemed fascinated by the idea that humans came from a world with so much water, so much chaos in their weather patterns. Jake did his best to describe snow to a being who had never seen frozen water fall from the sky. One time, after a long conversation about human families, the Queen had said something that stuck with Jake. She told him that Valerans were born knowing their place in society, that their instincts guided them to serve the hive. But humans, she said, chose their loyalties. They decided who to serve and why. She said that made them either very dangerous or very valuable, and she wasn't sure which. The palace had been tense for months now. Everyone knew that Prince Volfin, the Queen's nephew, was gathering support among the military. He thought the Queen was too old, too soft, too willing to negotiate with other species instead of conquering them. Jake had seen him during state functions, a massive Valoran with a shell so dark it was almost black, surrounded by warriors who looked at the Queen with barely concealed contempt. The other guards talked about it when they thought Jake couldn't hear. They discussed which side they would choose if it came to war. Kresh made it clear he would follow strength, and Prince Volfin was strong. Lyra said the Shardborn remained neutral in political conflicts. The Nethville guard just drifted away whenever the conversation started. Jake didn't join these conversations. He was hired to guard the Queen, so that's what he would do. It seemed simple to him, but the other guards found his attitude strange. They kept asking him what he would do if the prince made his move, if orders came to stand down, if the military declared a new ruler. Jake always gave the same answer: he would guard the queen. They seemed to think he was joking. Today was the Festival of Lights, a Valoran celebration that happened once every 5 years. The palace was filled with dignitaries from across the empire, and the halls glowed with special crystals that pulsed in complex patterns. Jake had extra ammunition in his belt, not because he expected trouble, but because Captain Vex, the head of palace security, had ordered all guards to be prepared for anything. Captain Vex was a professional, a Valoran who had served the royal family for 50 years. He was one of the few who treated Jake with respect, who acknowledged that the human had done his job well for 5 years without complaint. Yesterday, Vex had pulled Jake aside and spoken to him quietly, his mandibles clicking in the pattern that meant serious concern. The captain said that something was going to happen soon. He said that Jake should be ready to make a choice, and that whatever choice he made, it would define him for the rest of his life. Jake didn't fully understand, but he nodded and thanked the captain. Vex touched Jake's shoulder with one of his upper arms, a gesture of respect among Valorans, and walked away without another word. Now Jake stood at his post, watching the decorated corridors and listening to the sounds of celebration echoing through the palace. Other guards were stationed at intervals along the hallway, each one alert despite the festive atmosphere. Kresh was 50 feet to Jake's left, his red scales reflecting the pulsing lights. Lyra stood to the right, her crystalline body chiming softly as the sound vibrations from the festival moved through her. Queen Sivara was in her chambers, resting before the evening ceremony. She would have to appear before thousands of guests, would have to stand for hours while nobles and officials paid their respects. Jake knew she found it exhausting, but she never complained. She did her duty, just like he did his. The celebration music changed, becoming faster and more energetic. Jake could hear the crowd cheering somewhere deep in the palace. He allowed himself a small smile. Humans weren't big on tradition and ceremony like the Valorans were, but there was something beautiful about a culture that had maintained the same festivals for thousands of years. It made his own life feel very short in comparison. His communicator buzzed softly. It was a message from Kate, sent from Earth several days ago and just now reaching him through the relay networks. She had graduated from flight school and got her pilot's license. She was thinking about applying for an off-world position, maybe flying cargo runs between Earth and the outer colonies. Jake felt a mix of pride and worry. He typed back a quick congratulations and a warning to be careful, to read any contracts thoroughly before signing them. He had just put the communicator away when the lights flickered. It was subtle, just a brief dimming of the crystals, but Jake noticed. So did the other guards. Kresh's head swiveled, his yellow eyes narrowing. Lyra's chiming stopped abruptly, then the alarm started. The sound was deafening. A wailing siren that echoed through the crystal halls and made Jake's teeth ache. Emergency lights activated, bathing everything in harsh red. His training kicked in immediately. Jake moved to a defensive position in front of the Queen's door. His rifle raised, his eyes scanning for threats. Kresh received a message on his neural link. Jake saw the Kreth warrior's eyes go wide, saw him look toward the Queen's chambers and then back down the corridor. For a moment their eyes met. Then Kresh turned and ran, his heavy footfalls echoing as he disappeared around a corner. Jake's heart hammered in his chest. A guard didn't abandon his post. Ever, something was very wrong. Lyra shattered into 1,000 pieces, each fragment floating away in a different direction, reforming somewhere else in the palace through means Jake had never understood. The Nethville guard simply dispersed, becoming a cloud of gas that was sucked into the ventilation system. In less than 30 seconds. Jake was alone. He could hear weapons fire now, distant but getting closer. Heavy thuds that he recognized as combat mechs. Energy weapons tearing through walls. Screams in a dozen different alien languages. The palace was under attack, and every other guard had fled. Jake's hands shook slightly as he checked his rifle. He had 40 rounds in the magazine, another 3 magazines on his belt. Against mechs and energy weapons, that wasn't much. His communicator buzzed with emergency alerts, Messages from the human embassy ordering all Earth personnel to evacuate immediately. Providing coordinates for extraction points, he looked at the door behind him. Queen Sivara was in there, along with her attendants. They would have heard the alarms, would know something. The first blast door exploded inward with a sound like thunder. Jake had known it wouldn't hold long, but he had hoped for more than 5 minutes. Smoke filled the corridor as something massive pushed through the twisted metal, its mechanical joints hissing and whirring. A combat mech, military grade, painted in the dark colors of Prince Volthan's personal forces. Jake fired 3 quick bursts at the mech's sensor array. His bullet sparked off the armor plating but managed to crack one of the visual sensors. The mech's response was immediate and overwhelming. Its arm cannon swiveled toward him, and Jake dove behind a decorative pillar just as a bolt of superheated plasma turned his previous position into molten crystal. His heart was racing so fast he could hear it in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to find cover, to get out of this corridor before the next shot turned him into ash. But behind him was the door to the Queen's chambers, and he had promised to guard it. 2 soldiers in power armor followed the mech into the corridor. They moved with the confidence of professional warriors who had never faced real resistance. Jake recognized their armor markings as belonging to the elite strike teams, the best soldiers Prince Volthan commanded. Against them, Jake was just a human with a rifle and 5 years of guard duty experience. He didn't give them time to assess the situation. Jake rolled out from behind the pillar and fired at the gap between helmet and chestplate on the nearest soldier. The first 2 shots bounced off the armor, but the third found the seal and the soldier dropped, clutching his neck. The other soldier returned fire immediately, and Jake felt something hot slice across his left arm. Pain bloomed through him, but he managed to duck back behind cover. Blood ran down his arm and dripped onto the crystal floor. Jake tore a strip from his uniform sleeve and wrapped it around the wound, pulling it tight with his teeth. It wasn't a direct hit, just a graze, but it hurt more than anything he had experienced before. He had been shot at during training exercises, but training wasn't the same as having someone actually trying to kill you. The mech advanced, each footstep making the floor shake. Jake knew he couldn't fight it head-on. He needed to be smarter, faster, needed to use the environment. The palace was full of the same glowing crystals that provided light, and Jake had learned during his first week that they were somewhat fragile. He aimed up at the ceiling and fired a burst into the largest crystal formation. Directly above the mech, the crystals shattered and fell in a cascade of glowing fragments, each piece as sharp as glass. They bounced off the mech's armor but got into its joints, grinding against the mechanical parts. The mech's movement became jerky, less smooth. It wasn't much of an advantage, but Jake would take anything he could get. The remaining soldier moved to flank him, using the mech as cover. Jake could see the tactical logic. They would pin him in crossfire, and that would be the end of it. He needed to change the situation, do something unexpected. So he did the only thing he could think of that made no tactical sense whatsoever. He charged. Jake burst from behind the pillar and ran straight toward the soldier, firing as he moved. The soldier's armor took most of the hits, but Jake wasn't aiming for a kill. He just needed to close the distance. The soldier raised his energy weapon, but Jake was already too close. He slammed into the armored figure with his full body weight, which wasn't enough to knock him down, but was enough to make him stumble. Jake grabbed the soldier's weapon arm and pushed it up just as it fired. The energy bolt went wild, striking the ceiling and bringing down more crystal fragments. Then Jake did something that Captain Vex had taught him in hand-to-hand training. He swept the soldier's legs while pulling him forward, using the weight of the power armor against him. The soldier went down hard, and Jake drove his rifle but into the helmet's visor with all his strength. The visor cracked. Jake hit it again. And again. The soldier tried to throw him off, but the power armor was designed for strength, not speed, and Jake was much faster without it. On the 4th hit, the visor shattered completely, and Jake saw the Valeran inside, eyes wide with shock that a human had gotten this close. Jake didn't hesitate. He fired point-blank into the opening. Then he rolled away as the mech's targeting system finally locked onto him and fired. The plasma bolt hit the downed soldier instead, and Jake felt the wave of heat wash over him as he scrambled for new cover, 2 down. But his relief lasted only a moment because 4 more soldiers appeared at the shattered blast door, and another mech was pushing through behind them. Jake had maybe 15 rounds left in his magazine, and his left arm was going numb. This wasn't a battle he could win. This was just delaying the inevitable. A voice came through speakers on the lead mech, speaking in Velaran that Jake's translator processed. "Human Guard, you have fought well, but this is finished. Stand down and you will be allowed to leave unharmed. Prince Volthan has no quarrel with your species." Jake's response was to fire his remaining rounds at the mech's knee joint. He must have hit something important because the mech's leg locked up and it nearly fell before catching itself. The soldiers opened fire and Jake dove behind another pillar as energy bolts turned the air where he had been standing into a superheated haze. He ejected his empty magazine and slapped in a fresh one. 3 magazines left. Against 6 enemies and 2 mechs? The math wasn't good. But every second he held them here was another second for Queen Savara to escape through the hidden passages behind her chambers. The Queen's voice came through his communicator, soft and urgent. "Jake Morrison, I order you to withdraw. There is no shame in retreat when the battle cannot be won." Jake actually laughed, a short and a slightly crazy sound that surprised him. "No offense, Your Majesty, but I'm not big on following orders to abandon my post. It's kind of against my nature." He popped out and fired a burst at the soldiers who were trying to advance under the mech's cover. One of them took a round in the shoulder and fell back. Jake ducked away as return fire chewed into his cover, sending chips of crystal flying. "Your nature will get you killed," the Queen said. And Jake could hear something in her voice that sounded like concern. "Probably," he agreed, firing blind around the pillar just to keep the enemy cautious. "But at least I'll die doing what I said I would do." "Not sure what else we're supposed to do with our lives, Your Majesty." There was a long pause. When the Queen spoke again, her voice was different, stronger somehow. "Then if you insist on keeping your promise, I will keep mine. I will not flee while you fight alone. We will face what comes together." "Wait, no, that's not what I meant," Jake started, but the communication cut off. The soldiers were coordinating now, moving in a standard assault pattern. 2 would lay down suppressing fire while the others advanced. The mechs provided mobile cover and heavy firepower. It was textbook military tactics, and Jake had no good counter for it. He was one man with a rifle, and he was running out of places to hide. His next magazine went faster than he wanted. He managed to hit 1 more soldier in the leg, dropping him, but the others were getting closer. Jake fell back toward the Queen's door, firing short bursts to keep them at bay. His wounded arm was shaking now, and he could feel blood soaking through his makeshift bandage. A plasma bolt caught him in the side, and Jake went down hard. The shot hit his body armor, which absorbed most of the impact, but it felt like being kicked by a horse. He couldn't breathe for several seconds, just lay there gasping while his vision went dark at the edges. The soldiers rushed forward, thinking he was finished. Jake pulled his sidearm with his right hand and fired from the ground. He hit the leading soldier in the knee, the one weak point in power armor at that angle. The soldier collapsed and his fall tangled up the 2 behind him. It gave Jake enough time to roll behind a wide pillar and struggle back to his feet. Everything hurt. His left arm was useless now, just hanging at his side. His ribs felt like they were on fire, and each breath was agony. He had 2 magazines left for his rifle, but he could barely hold it with one hand. This was where his stand would end, but he had held them for 12 minutes. 12 minutes that Queen Savara could have used to escape. That had to count for something. The soldiers reorganized, more cautious now. They had learned that the human was more dangerous than he looked. The lid mech aimed its cannon at Jake's pillar, preparing to simply obliterate his cover and everything behind it. Jake made peace with his decision. He thought about his mom and Kate, hoped they would understand why he made this choice. He thought about all the times the other guards had mocked humans for being weak and temporary. At least he would prove them wrong about one thing. Humans knew how to die standing up. He checked his rifle one last time, took a deep breath that sent pain shooting through his chest, and prepared to step out for his final stand. He would take at least one more of them with him, but before he could move, the door behind him opened. Queen Savara emerged from her chambers, moving with a grace that belied her age. She was wearing her ceremonial robes, the ones reserved for the most important state functions, and she held a staff that marked her as the true ruler of the Valoran Empire. Her attendants followed, their faces showing fear but also determination. Pain brought Jake back to consciousness. Sharp, insistent pain that radiated from his side and arm, making every breath an effort. He opened his eyes slowly, trying to make sense of where he was and what had happened. The corridor swam into focus, still lit by the harsh red emergency lights, still filled with the smoke and heat of battle. He was lying on his back near the Queen's door. Someone had dragged him there, propped him against the crystal wall. His rifle was gone, his sidearm too. When he tried to move his left arm, nothing happened. It just hung there, dead weight, still bleeding through the soaked bandage. His body armor had a burned crater in it where the plasma bolt had hit, and when he touched his side, he had to bite back a scream. Queen Savara stood 10 feet away, facing the soldiers who had formed a semicircle in the corridor. They weren't advancing, weren't shooting, just waiting. Behind them, Jake could see the damaged mechs and the bodies of the soldiers he had managed to bring down. The sight made him feel dizzy with a mix of pride and horror. He had actually fought trained soldiers and survived. Barely. The Queen's attendants were pressed against the walls, clearly terrified but refusing to flee. Jake recognized them as the palace staff who had served Queen Savara for decades. They were not warriors, had probably never seen violence before, but they stayed because their queen stayed. It reminded Jake of something his father used to say about courage being contagious. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy and deliberate. The soldiers straightened at attention, and Jake knew what was coming before he saw him. Prince Volthan entered through the shattered blast door, and Jake's first thought was that the prince was enormous. He stood at least 9 feet tall, his shell so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, his compound eyes glittering like black diamonds. He wore military regalia covered in medals and honors, and he carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone who had never lost a battle. Behind the prince came more soldiers, these ones wearing the insignia of his personal guard. There were also several Valorans in civilian clothes who Jake recognized as members of the council, the nobles who advised the royal family. They looked uncomfortable, some avoiding the Queen's gaze, others staring at Jake with what might have been curiosity or disbelief. Prince Volthan stopped when he saw his aunt standing in the corridor, her ceremonial robes torn and dirty, but still carrying the weight of her position. His mandibles clicked in a pattern that Jake's translator couldn't quite process, something between anger and frustration. "And Savara, this is unnecessary theater. I had hoped to resolve this matter quietly, with dignity appropriate to your station. Instead, I find you standing in a corridor filled with corpses and damage, protected by a dying alien who should have fled when he had the chance." The Queen's voice was calm, almost gentle. "You speak of dignity, nephew, yet you launch an attack during the Festival of Lights, when the palace is filled with guests from across the Empire. You speak of quiet resolution while sending mechs and soldiers to murder an old woman in her chambers. Your words and your actions do not align." Volthan's shell seemed to darken further, if that was possible. "Murder is such an ugly word. I merely seek to ensure the Empire continues under strong leadership. You are old, Aunt. You have served well, but your time has passed. The galaxy is changing, becoming more dangerous. We need strength, not negotiation. Action, not hesitation." Jake tried to push himself up to stand, but his body wouldn't cooperate. The best he could manage was to prop himself into a slightly more upright position against the wall. It hurt worse than anything, but he refused to just lie there while this conversation happened. He was still a guard, even if he could barely move. Queen Savara noticed his movement and glanced back at him. Something passed between them in that look, some understanding that transcended species and language. Then she turned back to her nephew. "You want to know about strength, Volthan? Look at the floor. Count the soldiers who fell to one human with a rifle. This being from a species that joined the galactic community less than a generation ago. With technology we would consider primitive, with a body that can be broken so easily. Yet he stood alone when every other guard fled. He fought your elite soldiers in your mechs, and he held this corridor long enough for me to escape a dozen times over. That is strength. The prince barely glanced at Jake. He is brave, I grant you that. But bravery without power is just suicide with better publicity. He is one being. One command legions. His stand, while admirable, changes nothing. You are wrong, nephew. It changes everything. The queen moved to stand directly in front of Jake, as if shielding him even though he was already too injured to be a threat to anyone. Humans are not the strongest species, nor the fastest or the smartest. But they have something we lack, something that most species in the galaxy lack. They choose their loyalties. They are not born into service, not programmed by instinct to follow the hive. Each one decides for themselves what they value and who they will protect. One of the council members, a Valeran with a shell patterned in green and yellow, stepped forward hesitantly. Your Majesty, surely you exaggerate. All species make choices. Queen Sivara shook her head, a gesture she had learned from observing humans. We make choices within the boundaries set by our instincts. When danger comes, we follow our programming. We flee or fight based on what our biology tells us. But this human, she gestured to Jake, made a choice that went against every survival instinct in his body. He stayed when logic said to run. He fought when numbers said to surrender. And he did it not because his genes commanded it, but because he gave his word. Jake wanted to say something, to tell her that he wasn't special, that any decent person would have done the same. But his throat was too dry, and the effort of staying conscious was taking all his strength. Blood pooled beneath him, too much blood, and he was starting to feel cold despite the heat in the corridor. Prince. Volfin looked at Jake for the first time with something that might have been real interest. Then he is a fool. Honor and promises are pretty concepts, but they do not build empires. They do not win wars. No, agreed the queen. But they build something more valuable than empires. They build trust. They create bonds that survive death and defeat. You command legions today, Volfin, but can you trust them? If this coup fails, if the military turns against you, will your soldiers stay? Or will they flee like the guards who abandoned their posts tonight? The words hung in the air, and Jake saw several of the soldiers shift uncomfortably. The council members exchanged glances. Even Prince Volfin seemed thrown by the question, Queen Sivara continued, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher addressing a student. For 3,000 years, our empire has endured because each generation made the same choice. We chose to honor our oaths, to serve the greater good over personal ambition. But in recent centuries, we have forgotten why we make those choices. We follow tradition blindly, without understanding its meaning. And now we see the result. My own guards fled when challenged, even though they were bred for loyalty. They had the instinct, but not the understanding. She turned to look at Jake again, and her voice softened. But this human understood. He comes from a species that had to learn cooperation, that had to choose to build civilizations despite having no biological imperative to do so. His people spent millennia fighting each other before they learned to work together. And because they chose it, because they built their loyalties on decision rather than instinct, those loyalties run deeper than any programming. Jake's vision was getting blurry. He knew he was dying, could feel his life leaking out onto the crystal floor. But he understood what the queen was doing. She wasn't trying to save herself. She was trying to teach her nephew something, to leave him with a lesson that might change how he ruled. Even now, facing her own death, she was thinking about the future of her empire. Prince Volfin raised his weapon, a sophisticated energy pistol that would kill instantly. Your lesson is noted, Aunt, but it changes nothing. My rule begins tonight, with or without your blessing. I ask one final time, will you yield the throne peacefully, or must I take it by force? The queen stood straighter, and Jake saw in her the ruler she had been for 2 centuries, the strength that had guided an empire through war and peace. I will never yield to one who takes power through betrayal and violence. If you wish to rule, you must kill me, Volfin. But know that every being in this empire will know what you did. They will know that you killed your own blood, that you murdered an old woman who did nothing but try to teach you wisdom. Is that how you want your reign to begin?" The prince's weapon didn't waver. "If that is your choice, I accept the consequences. The empire will understand that difficult times require difficult decisions." He aimed the weapon at his aunt's head, and Jake knew he had only seconds to act. His body was broken, his weapons gone, but he still had his weight and his will. He pushed off from the wall with his one good arm, throwing himself forward with the last of his strength. He didn't make it far. His legs couldn't support him, and he collapsed after just 2 feet, falling face first onto the crystal floor. But it was enough too. The shot never came. Prince Volthan stood with his weapon raised, his finger on the trigger, while everyone in the corridor held their breath. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Then slowly the prince lowered his weapon and turned away. "Take my aunt to her chambers and place guards at her door. She will remain under house arrest until we determine what to do with her." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Someone call the medical team for the human, now." One of the council members stepped forward, his voice uncertain. "Your Highness, why save the human? He is merely a guard, and a failed one at that." Volthan turned on the counselor with sudden fury. "Failed? You call this failure? Look around you. Count the bodies. This human held a corridor against my best. Soldiers for 18 minutes with nothing but small arms and determination. He should have broken in the first 30 seconds. Any reasonable being would have fled or surrendered, but he stayed. He fought, and he nearly ruined everything by making this quiet coup into a public spectacle." The prince's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of barely controlled anger. "My aunt is right about one thing. This human's actions will be remembered. And if we treat his sacrifice with contempt, if we let him bleed out on the floor like garbage, then every species in the galaxy will know that we reward loyalty with death. How many guards do you think will stand their post after that? How many allies will trust our word?" Jake drifted in and out of consciousness as the medical team arrived. They were Valerans in white shells marked with medical symbols, and they moved with efficient precision. One of them scanned him with a device that hummed and beeped, then spoke in rapid Valeran that Jake's failing translator couldn't keep up with. He felt himself being lifted onto some kind of stretcher, felt the prick of injections that dulled the worst of the pain. Queen Sivara's face appeared above him, her compound eyes reflecting the emergency lights, and she said something he couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. Then she was gone, escorted away by soldiers who handled her with careful respect despite being her captors. The journey to the medical center was a blur of corridors and lights and voices speaking languages he didn't understand. Jake tried to stay conscious, tried to keep track of where they were taking him, but his body had other ideas. The darkness kept pulling at him, promising rest and an end to the pain. He woke up in a hospital bed surrounded by machines that beeped and whirred. His left arm was in some kind of cast that glowed with soft blue light, probably filled with Valeran medical technology that was fixing bones and tissue faster than Earth medicine could imagine. His side was wrapped in bandages that felt warm as if they were actively doing something to heal him. And 4 ran into his right arm, pumping fluids into his body that made everything feel fuzzy and distant. A Valeran doctor stood nearby, reviewing data on a holographic display. She noticed Jake was awake and moved to his bedside, speaking in accented but clear English. "You are very fortunate to be alive, human. Your species is remarkably fragile. You lost nearly 30% of your blood volume, your left humerus was fractured in 2 places, and the plasma burn to your torso should have killed you. But your biology is stubborn. You kept breathing when you should have died, kept fighting when you should have fallen unconscious. Very stubborn indeed." Jake tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. The doctor noticed and brought a cup of water with a straw. He sipped carefully, the cool liquid feeling like a miracle. "The Queen?" he managed to ask. The doctor's expression was hard to read, but she seemed sad. "Queen Sivara is alive and unharmed, physically at least. She is confined to her chambers under guard. Prince Volthan has declared himself emperor and is consolidating power. The military supports him, as do most of the noble houses. There has been no major violence beyond the attack on the palace. It seems the coup will succeed. Jake closed his eyes, trying to process this information. He had failed, then. All that fighting, all that blood, and the queen was still a prisoner. The bad guys had won. Do not judge yourself too harshly, the doctor said, as if reading his thoughts. You did something extraordinary. The entire palace is talking about the human who stood alone. The soldiers who fought you, those who survived, they speak of you with respect. Prince Volthan himself ordered that you receive the best medical care available. You are being treated as a hero, not an enemy. That didn't make sense to Jake. I fought against him. I tried to stop the coup. Yes, and that is precisely why you're being honored. The doctor adjusted something on one of the machines. You must understand, our society runs on instinct and tradition. When the moment came, every guard except you followed their survival programming. They fled because that is what their genes told them to do when faced with overwhelming force. But you chose differently. You made a decision that went against your instincts, against logic, against every reasonable calculation. That choice is fascinating to us. She paused, her mandibles clicking thoughtfully. Emperor Volthan is many things, but he is not stupid. He understands that power without loyalty is fragile. He needs soldiers and guards who will stand their post even when things seem hopeless. Your example shows that such loyalty is possible, even from species like yours who are not bred for service. It gives him hope that he can build a military that will not crumble at the first sign of difficulty. Jake felt a bitter laugh building in his chest. So I'm useful propaganda. Perhaps. But you are also a genuine inspiration. The humans at your embassy have been calling constantly, demanding to see you. Several ambassadors from other species have requested meetings. There are reporters from 20 different news networks waiting outside the hospital. Everyone wants to know about the human who stayed when all others fled. The door opened and a new Valeran entered, this one wearing military regalia. Jake recognized him as Captain Vex, the head of palace security. The captain's shell looked duller than Jake remembered, his movements slower. He approached the bed and stood at attention, a formal military posture. Guard Morrison, I come on behalf of Emperor Volthan to express his regrets for your injuries. You fought with honor and courage, and you will be compensated accordingly. Your contract is considered fulfilled with distinction. Your transportation back to Earth will be arranged as soon as the doctors clear you for travel. Jake stared at him. What about the Queen? Captain Vex's mandibles clicked softly. That is no longer your concern. Queen Sivara is no longer your employer. Your oath of service ended when she was removed from power. That's not how oaths work, Jake said, his voice rough but firm. I promised to guard her. I didn't promise to guard her only while she was winning. The captain was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost sad. You shame us, human. You shame every guard who fled, every soldier who placed survival over duty. The Emperor asked me why you stayed when escape was possible. I had no answer for him because I myself ran when the fighting began. I told myself it was tactical, that I was following the chain of command, that I could be more useful elsewhere. But the truth is that I was afraid, and my fear was stronger than my oath. He reached into a pocket and pulled out something that glinted in the hospital lights. Jake's dog tags, bent and scored from the fighting, but still intact. The captain placed them on the bed beside Jake. I found these in the corridor. You should have them back. They bear your name and your planet of origin. Simple metal stamped with basic information, yet you carried them into battle like they were sacred. Because to you, they are. They represent who you are and what you believe. We Valerans wear our loyalty on our shells and our genetic code. But you humans must choose it every day, must carry it with you and remember why it matters. Captain Vex straightened to attention and saluted, a human gesture that looked awkward when performed by a six-limbed insectoid. Thank you, Guard Morrison, for reminding me what it means to serve with honor. I will not forget the lesson. The captain left, and Jake was alone with the doctor again. He picked up his dog tags, feeling the familiar weight of them in his hand. They were scratched and dented, but they still read his name and serial number. still identified him as human, as someone from Earth, as someone who had once promised to serve and protect. The next 3 days passed in a blur of medical treatments, interviews, and visits. The human ambassador came with a security team, offering to evacuate Jake immediately if he felt threatened. Jake politely declined, saying he wanted to recover enough to walk on his own first. The ambassador looked confused but agreed. Representatives from 12 different species visited, each one asking questions about human culture, human values, human capacity for loyalty. Jake did his best to answer, though he felt unqualified to speak for his entire species. He kept trying to explain that he wasn't special, that any decent person would have done the same, but they didn't seem to believe him. On the 4th day, Jake had an unexpected visitor. Prince Volthan, now Emperor Volthan, entered the hospital room with minimal security. He was even more imposing up close, his dark shell seeming to fill the space. He stood at the foot of Jake's bed, studying him with those compound eyes that reflected light like polished stone. The meeting with Queen Sivara happened in her chambers, which had been stripped of most of their grandeur. The crystal throne was gone, replaced with simple furniture. The walls that once displayed thousands of years of royal history were bare. But the queen herself seemed unchanged. Sitting with the same quiet dignity Jake remembered from his years of service. 2 guards stood at the door, watching everything but staying silent. Jake had been cleared by the doctors that morning and could walk with only minor pain. His left arm was still healing, held in a support brace that the doctors said he could remove in another week. The burns on his side had faded to pink scars that would probably stay with him forever. Queen Sivara rose when he entered, a gesture of respect that felt wrong coming from someone who had ruled an empire for 2 centuries. Jake Morrison, I am pleased to see you recovering well. I feared my nephew would not honor his promise to care for you. Jake didn't know the proper protocol anymore. She wasn't his queen, wasn't anyone's queen really, but she was still the person he had fought for. He settled for a respectful nod. Your Majesty. I'm glad to see you're okay. I'm as well as can be expected for one who has lost everything except her life. She gestured to a chair, inviting him to sit, and she settled across from him. I asked to see you because I wanted to thank you properly, without soldiers and politics interfering. You gave me a gift that I never expected to receive, especially from an alien I hired on a whim. I was just doing my job, ma'am. No, your job was to stand at a door and look intimidating. Your job did not include fighting an army alone or nearly dying to give an old woman time to escape. That was choice, pure and simple, and it was the most valuable thing anyone has given me in a very long time. She reached out with one of her upper arms and touched his shoulder gently, the same gesture Captain Vex had used years ago to show respect. You showed me that I was right about your species. Humans are not bound by genetic programming or ancient instincts. You choose your loyalties, and because you choose them, they run deeper than any biological imperative. The galaxy will learn this lesson because of you. Jake felt uncomfortable with the praise. I didn't stay to prove anything about humans. I stayed because I gave my word and breaking it felt wrong, that's all. That's all, the Queen repeated, and her mandibles moved in what Jake had learned was the Valeran equivalent of a smile. You say that as if it is simple, as if everyone would make the same choice, but they wouldn't, Jake Morrison. Most beings in this galaxy would have fled. They would have chosen survival, and no one would have blamed them. But you chose differently, and that choice will echo far longer than either of us will live. They talked for an hour about small things. The Queen asked about his recovery, about his plans to return to Earth, about his family. Jake told her about Kate, about how his sister wanted to become a pilot and see the galaxy. The Queen seemed pleased by this, said that the galaxy needed more humans willing to venture beyond their comfortable planet. When it was time to leave, the Queen stood and spoke formally, her voice taking on the tone of royal pronouncement. Jake Morrison of Earth, I release you from your oath of service. You have fulfilled every promise you made and exceeded every expectation I held. Go home to your world and your family. Live well, and know that you carry with you the gratitude of a queen who has little else left to give. Jake wanted to say something meaningful, something that would match the weight of the moment. But all he could manage was, "Thank you, Your Majesty, for everything. I hope your exile is peaceful." As do I and Jake. When your sister ventures into the galaxy, tell her to remember your example. Tell her that humans have something precious to offer the universe, something that cannot be bought or manufactured. You offer your word and you keep it. Never lose that, no matter how long you live among the stars. Jake left the chambers knowing he would never see her again. The thought made him sad in a way he hadn't expected. For 5 years, guarding this Alien Queen had been his purpose, his daily routine, his reason for being light years from home. Now that purpose was gone, and he would have to figure out what came next. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks on a commercial transport. Jake spent most of it staring out at the stars, thinking about everything that had happened. News of the coup and his part in it had spread across the galaxy with the speed that only modern communication could achieve. Every news network had covered the story, each one with a different angle. Some focused on the military tactics of the coup. Some analyzed the political implications for the Valoran Empire. But most talked about the human guard who stayed when everyone else fled. They interviewed experts on human psychology, anthropologists who studied Earth cultures, military analysts who tried to explain how one lightly armed guard held off a strike team for 18 minutes. Jake watched some of the coverage and turned it off quickly. They were talking about someone who seemed like a stranger, a hero who existed only in stories and propaganda. The real Jake Morrison was just a guy who made a choice and got lucky enough to survive it. Earth looked beautiful from orbit. Old blue oceans and white clouds and green-brown continents. Jake had seen dozens of alien worlds in his travels, some more technologically advanced and some more naturally stunning, but none of them felt like home the way Earth did. This was where humans belonged, where they had evolved and struggled and built civilizations from nothing. His mom met him at the spaceport along with Kate and what seemed like half the population of their hometown. There were reporters, of course, shouting questions and trying to get interviews. There were government officials offering commendations and opportunities. There were military recruiters hoping to sign him up for training programs. Jake ignored all of them and focused on his family. His mom hugged him hard enough to make his healing ribs ache, and she cried into his shoulder while telling him never to scare her like that again. Kate punched his good arm and called him an idiot, but her eyes were wet too. They drove home in Kate's old truck, avoiding the main roads to escape the media attention. Home was a small house on the edge of town, the same house Jake had grown up in. His room was exactly as he left it 5 years ago, full of posters and books and memories of a simpler time. It felt surreal to be back, like putting on clothes that didn't quite fit anymore. Over dinner, his mom asked careful questions about what happened on Velara Prime. Jake gave her the basics, leaving out the worst parts about injuries and pain and thinking he was going to die. Kate saw through the omissions but didn't call him on it. She just listened, her eyes bright with interest. After their mom went to bed, Kate cornered him in the kitchen. "Okay, no sanitized version, what really happened?" So Jake told her everything. The fear, the pain, the absolute certainty that he was going to die in that corridor. The moment when he had to choose between running or staying, between saving himself or keeping his promise. The way Queen Sivara had held him while he bled, refusing to let him die alone. Kate was quiet for a long time after he finished. Then she said, "I got accepted to the pilot program. 3 different companies want to hire me for transport runs between Earth and the colonies. The pay is incredible. I could retire in 10 years if I wanted. But after hearing your story, I'm not sure I want to just fly cargo." "You made a difference up there, Jake. You changed how aliens see us. Maybe I could do something like that too." Jake thought about Queen Sivara's words, about how the galaxy needed more humans willing to venture out and show what they were capable of. You should do it. Not because you need to prove anything, but because you want to see what's out there. Just be careful. The galaxy is bigger and stranger than anything we learned in school, and not everyone will be friendly. Says the guy who fought an army alone. I had no choice. You will. Promise me you'll be smart about it. Kate smiled and punched his arm again, gentler this time. "I promise." And you promise to stop being a hero and give Mom a few years of not worrying about you getting killed. Deal. The next few months were strange for Jake. The Valoran pension was generous enough that he didn't need to work, but he couldn't just sit around either. He took a job as a security consultant for companies that did business off-world, teaching them about alien cultures and how to navigate the complicated politics of the galactic community. Offers came in constantly. Governments wanted him to train their soldiers. Corporations wanted him for private security. Alien species reached out with job opportunities that ranged from bodyguard work to diplomatic positions. Jake turned most of them down. He had spent 5 years in space and he needed time to be human again, to remember what it felt like to live on a planet where the sky was blue and the gravity was normal. But he watched the news about the galaxy, followed the developments on Velara Prime and other worlds. Emperor Volthan had stabilized his rule and seemed to be keeping his promises about reform. Queen Sivara was living quietly on a colony world, by all accounts content with her exile. The Valoran military had started recruiting more alien species for guard positions, specifically seeking humans who showed loyalty and determination. Humanity's status in the galactic community changed rapidly. Before Jake's stand, humans were seen as curious novelties,